G'day and welcome to another video with Better Pics. Hope this finds everyone well. Today I wanted to create a quick video on adjusting footage into slow motion in Premiere Pro. It's a pretty quick and easy, straightforward process, but there's a few steps in it, so let's have a very quick look at it. Now I'm actually going to show three ways to make those adjustments or to create slow motion on your timeline. But first we need to start with a sequence. As you can see at the moment, we've got a project. There's two clips that have been imported. You can see that they're 50 frames per second, but we don't actually have a sequence at the moment. So what I'm going to do is just create a 25 frame per second sequence, and you'll see why very, very shortly. So if we just go up to File and New and Sequence, and what I'm going to do is go into DNxHR, Ultra HD 25, and we'll go HQ Ultra High Definition, sorry, at 25 frames a second. Now, these don't actually make too much of a difference, or any difference really, to the actual sequence. They're just presets for sequences that are built into Premiere, so you can choose any one and you're going to get the same results. Alright, so I'm going to hit OK. Excellent, now we have our sequence there. Now you can see that I selected Ultra HD or 4K 3840 by 2160, and the reason that I did that is because these clips they were filmed in Ultra HD, so just so that those clips fit natively onto the timeline. Alright, so let's just talk briefly about what it actually means to film at a higher frame rate and create slow motion. So for a 25 frame per second timeline or video that we're going to create, that's based on the broadcast standards for myself, which I live in Australia, where 25 frames per second is the norm. Now, depending on where you live in the world, you might have a 30 frames per second video, or you might be creating a film and you have a timeline at 24 frames per second. Doesn't really matter. The main thing is that you have footage that has a higher frame rate than the timeline, because what we're going to do is change the distribution of frames over the time period within the timeline, and that's how we create our slow motion. So you can see that the clips that I have are at 50 frames per second, and the timeline that I have set up, or the sequence that I've set up, is at 25 frames per second. So the way that slow motion works is we have 50 frames per second, and we're going to distribute those onto a timeline at 25 frames per second, which means that 50 frames per second is not going to take up a second, it's actually going to take up 2 seconds, because those frames will be distributed over that 2 seconds, playing back at 25 frames per second. So if you've got a 50 frame per second clip on a 25 frame per second timeline, it will be half speed. Exactly the same as if you have a clip that is 100 frames per second and you redistribute those frames at 25 frames per second, it will be a quarter speed. So 1 second will become 4 seconds. Hope that makes sense. So what we want to do is establish or change these clips to play back at 25 frames per second. Now, if I simply click and drag that clip onto the timeline, you can see I'm going to get a warning. This clip does not match the sequence settings. Change sequence to match the clip's settings. So it's asking, do we want to make this sequence 50 frames per second? Now, we don't want to do that, because we obviously want to redistribute those frames over 25 frames per second instead of 50. So we're going to keep the existing settings. Now that clip has dropped into the timeline, as you can see, and we're just going to mute that audio so that it's not distracting. And you can see when I play that clip back, it's just playing back at normal speed. So that completely is normal. Alright, so what we're going to do now is make adjustments to these clips so that they play back in slow motion. Alright. So let's just stop it there. I'm going to delete that clip. The first of 3 methods that we're going to demonstrate today around how to do that. Let's right click on the clip while it's in the project tab, and we're going to go up to modify and then across to interpret footage. Now what this basically allows us to do, just drag that across, is assume, we're going to use this little checkbox here, assume this frame rate. So what it's saying is assume that the clip is whatever frame rate we enter into that little box. So the first thing we do is we assume that the frame rate is 25 because that's what our sequence is. We hit OK, and you can see straight away that that clip that we've just adjusted is now 25 frames per second. And if we click and drag that onto the timeline, you can see it's now double the length. So essentially what that's doing is we're saying to Premiere, don't assume that this clip is don't assume this clip is 50 frames per second, assume that it's 25. So we're redistributing those 50 frames that have been created per second to 25 frames per second. So that allows us to then drop that clip onto the timeline, and we'll hit play, and you can see it is now playing in slow motion. So it's playing at half speed. Excellent, so that works perfectly. So that is the first technique of creating slow motion in Premiere. So right click, go up to modify and interpret footage, and you can see the assumed frame rate, which we'd previously entered, is 25 frames per second. Excellent. Let's delete that clip and let's go back one step so that we are back to both clips with a 50 frames per second speed. All right. So the next method that I'm going to demonstrate on how to create slow motion within Premiere is to actually drop that clip onto the timeline. And we're going to get that warning again. We still want to keep existing settings, so we still want that timeline to be 25 frames per second. And we're going to select the clip, right click, and we're going to go speed duration, which is right here in the middle. All right, so you can see at the moment it's 100% speed, which means that the clip is going to play back at a normal speed. Now we know, being a 50 frame per second clip on a 25 frame per second timeline, that when that's played back at 50 frames per second, it's going to be half speed, which is, of course, 50%. So if we hit OK, you can see that that clip has now doubled. And if we play that clip, it is playing back beautifully in slow motion, as you can see, exactly the same as what it was before. So that is also a technique that works perfectly. You can see that the clip within the timeline is still within the project is still at 50 frames per second, but we're simply playing back that clip at half speed. So again, select that clip, right click, speed duration, and 50%. Now, if you had a 100 frame per second clip, you would enter 25% because we're obviously playing it back at a quarter the speed. If that's what you want to go for, you could still enter 50% and play it back at half speed. All right, so that works perfectly. All right, so what we're going to do is just go back to our original 50 frame per second clip that has been dropped onto our timeline. You can see it's still 50 frames per second on the in the project there. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at the third method to be able to create slow motion on a timeline in Premiere Pro. Alright, so the third method that we're going to use to be able to slow down this footage to a slow motion clip is called over here on the right hand side, the rate stretch tool. You can see on the toolbar there, the shortcut is R. And basically what that allows me to do is to select and drag the clip and make it pretty much as long as I want. So obviously 50% for this clip is going to allow it to be made up of the actual frames that were captured in the original file. Obviously if we go any longer than that, we're going to start getting down to, you can see here it's down to roughly 29.5%. So what's happening there is we're now distributing the clip across a greater area or a greater length of time than what the clip actually had for frames to make up that amount of time. So based on the speed of the timeline, which in this case is 25 frames per second. So what you want to be careful thereof is for the footage to start looking jumpy and a bit jittery, which you can see it is a little bit in that water flowing down off the cliff. So we do want to be careful. Now, if you are going to make the clip longer than what it will actually handle based on the original frames captured, if you right click on the clip and you head up to time interpolation and you make sure you click on Optical Flow. Now, this isn't a perfect solution. It doesn't always work well depending on what it is that you're creating. But basically what it does is it interpolates the footage to create frames based on the movement within the footage. So it's making up the difference. It's kind of like increasing an image file past its native resolution and you're creating pixels out of nothing. But it uses a kind of algorithm that takes into account what's in between each frame, and then it makes a new frame so that it can hopefully slow the footage down further and it looks smooth. So make sure that you do always right click and time interpolation and click Optical Flow. Again, it doesn't always work perfectly, but it will give you the best possible scenario or the best possible outcome for the flow of the movement in the clip. All right, so let's just have a look at that. And you can see that is flowing a little bit smoother. If we actually go to render out this clip within the project, if we go up to sequence and render entire work area, this will allow us to be able to look at the clip in full clarity to make sure that it is actually playing smoothly and looking as best as what it can. So we'll just wait for that to go through. There we go. All right, so you can see that section is now green, which means it should play smoothly, and it is. It's looking pretty good. So that seems to be working okay. Again, it really is dependent on the clip that you have and the type of subject matter that's moving within the clip. It doesn't always work perfectly, but it's certainly worth experimenting with to see what sort of results you get. So just looking at those three methods that we've used for creating slow motion in a timeline. The first one is to right click on the clip within the project tab and head to modify and interpret footage, and then we can enter the frame rate that we would like to based on the timeline that we're using. The next method is to right click on the clip within the sequence or the timeline and head up to speed duration, and you can obviously make adjustments there to slow the clip down where you see fit. And the third method is to use the rate stretch tool, which the shortcut is R, and that allows you to stretch the clip to perhaps fill a specific space that you want it to fill based on an edit that you may be doing. Remember, right click always to use under time interpolation optical flow. If you are stretching the clip to longer than what is generally allowable based on the number of frames within the clip, that will help to smooth the interpolation of new frames and hopefully give you a good result. Alright, so those are the three methods for this video on achieving slow motion footage in a Premiere Pro timeline. Hope this video has been helpful, and as always, any questions, please pop them in the comments below. Happy to help where I can, and hope you have a great day. Take care.